My husband stood in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March and told me he wanted a divorce. I had been expecting that. What I had not been expecting was what he said next. He said, "I want the house. I want both cars. I want the business, the investments, the savings account. Everything." He slid a piece of paper across the counter toward me. His attorney had already typed it up. Every asset, every account, every item of value we had built across 12 years of marriage, all of it. It's listed neatly with his name beside each one. And then he looked up, almost as an afterthought, and said, "You can have full custody of our son. I will not fight you on that." Our son, 14 years old, just like that, handed over. Like he was an item on the list that Marcus had simply decided he did not want. The next morning, I sat in my attorney's office and showed her that paper. She put her hand on my arm across the conference table and said, "Claire, we fight every single line of this. You will walk away with half of everything, I promise you. Do not agree to this." I looked at her. I looked at that paper, and I said, "Give it all to him." She thought I had broken. My mother thought I had lost my mind. Marcus thought he had already won. None of them understood what I already knew. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you are going to understand exactly what I knew. And you are never going to look at the word surrender the same way again. And if you are new here, hit subscribe right now. This is exactly the kind of story we tell. My name is Claire Hargrove, and before I tell you how this ended, I need to tell you how it began, because the beginning matters more than most people realize. I want to be honest with you from the very first sentence. This is not a story about a perfect woman destroyed by a villain. Life is rarely that simple, and I respect you too much to pretend otherwise. This is a story about two imperfect people, a marriage that quietly fell apart over many years, and one woman who, when the ground disappeared beneath her feet, chose to build something better from the bottom up. Marcus and I met in our late 20s at a professional conference. He was in commercial real estate. I had just finished my business degree with a focus on financial analysis. We were both ambitious, both driven, and at the time that felt like a foundation. It was. For a while. We got married in the spring. We bought our house 3 years later. And in our 4th year of marriage, we had Ethan. Ethan changed everything, the way children do when they arrive and rearrange your entire understanding of what matters. I made the decision, with Marcus's full support, to step back from my corporate career temporarily, not permanently, temporarily. I wanted to be present for my son's first years. I believed that was worth the sacrifice. What I did not realize at the time was that in Marcus's private way of thinking, my stepping back translated to something else entirely, something permanent, as though choosing our son over my career had somehow made me smaller in his eyes, less of a partner, more of a fixture in the house he owned. I did not notice the shift right away. It came in small moments over years. The way he stopped asking about my opinions at dinner, the way he spoke over me at gatherings with his business contacts, the way my name disappeared from conversations about our future, and the word "I" began replacing the word "we" when he talked about what he wanted his life to look like. But here is the thing about me that Marcus fundamentally misread from the very beginning. I am not loud. I have never been loud. I do not argue when I can observe. I do not react when I can plan. And I do not stop building simply because someone stops watching. During those years at home, the years Marcus called my quiet period, I was earning financial consulting certifications. I was building a client base, slowly and carefully from our home office. I was reading, studying, and growing a practice that Marcus knew about in the vague way that you know about weather in a city you have never visited. He called it my little side project. He said it with a kind of affection in the early years that turned into dismissal as time went on. He had no real idea what that little side project had become, and that, right there, is where this entire story begins. I want to tell you something that I think is important. The end of a marriage is almost never a single moment. It is a long, quiet season of small moments that you file away one by one, like telling yourself each time that it means nothing until the day you look up and realize the file is full. The first real crack I can point to came about 5 years before the divorce, when Marcus entered a new business partnership with a woman named Diane Forsyth, who ran a high-end property development company. She was polished and professional. I shook her hand at a company dinner and felt nothing unusual, nothing alarming, except that when Marcus introduced me as his wife, she looked at him for just a half-second too long. I filed that away. Over the following 18 months, the man I had married became someone I barely recognized in my own home. He worked late without explanation. He was short-tempered with Ethan over small things. He took business trips to cities his clients had never come from. His phone went everywhere with him, face down on every surface. I did not cry. I did not confront. I observed. And I began, very quietly, to prepare. I want to be clear about something. I was not preparing for war. I was preparing for the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. I have always believed that the most dangerous position a person can be in is an uninformed one. So I got informed. I opened a personal savings account, not a joint account, a personal one, and I began directing a portion of my consulting income into it every month, not large amounts, consistent ones. I also reached out to an old business school friend named Janet, who works as a forensic accountant. I told her I needed to understand our complete financial picture, not to hide anything, to understand. What Janet found over the following few months took my breath away. Not because Marcus was stealing from me, he was not, but because of what he had done with the business we had technically co-founded together. 6 years into our marriage, when Marcus launched his real estate investment firm, I had contributed a significant portion of our joint savings to its startup. My name was never put into the operational structure. Marcus had told me it was simpler legally. He had said that as his wife, everything was equally mine anyway. I trusted that. I signed where he asked me to sign. What Janet showed me was that over the previous 2 years, Marcus had been quietly restructuring the business, shifting assets between categories, reclassifying what counted as income versus what counted as a business expense, doing it in ways that, while not screaming fraud, were aggressive enough to attract serious attention. IRS attention, specifically. There were 3 years of tax filings with significant problems, and those filings were connected to an entity that carried both of our names. I sat with that information for a long time. I thought about it carefully. I prayed about it. I talked to no one. And then, like 8 weeks before Marcus walked into the kitchen with that piece of paper, I made a phone call. I called the IRS whistleblower office. I submitted everything Janet had documented, formally, officially, under the full protection of federal whistleblower law. I was cooperative, thorough, and completely protected from any liability because I had not been involved in the filings. I was the source, not the subject. Marcus did not know. He was too busy planning the divorce to notice the ground shifting beneath the house he was about to ask for. I need to tell you about the list, because the list is the heart of this story. And I want you to understand not just what was on it, but what each item meant. to Marcus, and to me. The first item was the house, 4 bedrooms, a finished basement where Ethan had spent hundreds of hours building model rockets and teaching himself guitar. Now a backyard with a garden that Ethan and I had planted together when he was 9. Tomatoes, sunflowers, and one stubborn rose bush that refused to die no matter what the weather threw at it. That house held 12 years of a life, holidays and arguments and sick days and Sunday mornings. It had been appraised at just under $1 million. Marcus wanted it. What Marcus did not know was that the house sat inside the business's asset structure, a result of a refinancing arrangement that Marcus himself had set up 3 years earlier. When the IRS inquiry began to move forward, that property was directly in its path. A federal tax lien had been filed against it the day before our final hearing. Owning that house was about to become a very expensive problem. The second item was the cars, a large luxury SUV and a high-end sedan. Both impressive to look at. Both registered under the business name. Both being paid for through a business line of credit, not purchased outright. The actual equity in either vehicle, what you would truly own after subtracting what was owed, was almost nothing. Marcus was not taking 2 cars. He was taking 2 car payments. The third item was the investment accounts. This one genuinely hurt when I first read it. We had built roughly $380,000 in joint brokerage accounts across our marriage. That was real money, earned over real years, and I will not pretend it did not sting to see it on a list with his name beside it. But here is what Marcus did not know. 18 months earlier, around the time Janet first started showing me what our financial picture actually looked like, I had begun directing my consulting income into a completely separate personal investment account. My name only. Built entirely from income Marcus had dismissed as insignificant. That account had grown quietly and steadily. He could not touch a single dollar of it because he did not know it existed. He was taking the joint account. Well, he was leaving my personal account completely alone, simply because he had never bothered to look. The fourth item was the business itself, the firm he had built, his name on the door. His identity, really. The thing he talked about most, the thing that defined how he saw himself in the world. He wanted it entirely. I let him have it. The business that was currently under IRS examination, the business whose 3 years of aggressive tax filings were now being reviewed by federal auditors. Not the business whose true financial position, once you accounted for the liability that was building, was far, far below its surface appearance. I let him have every bit of it. When my attorney Sandra reviewed the list a second time, after I had quietly walked her through some of what I knew, she sat back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Claire, you are not surrendering. You are performing a controlled demolition." That is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said to describe what I did. I was not giving up. I was handing a man a beautifully wrapped box and watching him smile, not yet knowing that when he finally opened it, all that would be inside were the consequences of his own choices. When word got around our social circle, and it always does during a divorce, no matter how carefully you carry yourself, the verdict on Claire Hargrove was fast and unanimous. She had lost her mind. My mother called me every single day for 3 weeks. She reminded me about the furniture. My grandmother's dining table was in that house. The mirror in the hallway that had been in our family for 40 years. You cannot just give the man your grandmother's mirror, Claire. She was not wrong about any of it, and I loved her fiercely for caring. When my best friend Renee sat across from me at our regular coffee place and looked at me the way you look at someone you are genuinely worried about. She said, Has he threatened you? Has he done something that you are not telling me? Because you are the most strategic person I have ever met in my entire life, and what you are doing right now does not make any sense." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I said, "Trust the process." She stared at me for a solid 4 seconds. Then she said very slowly, "Claire, that is what people say right before they do something they regret." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I had experienced in months. Marcus, for his part, was gracious in the way that deeply satisfied people sometimes are. He told mutual friends that he felt terrible about how things had turned out, but that Claire had been surprisingly reasonable and that the process had been smoother than expected. He said I had shown real maturity. He posted something on social media, standing in front of the house, a caption about new chapters and gratitude. Diane Forsyth liked the post within 3 minutes. I took a screenshot of it, not for anger, for the record. And then there was Ethan. My son was 14 years old at the time of the divorce, and he was sharper than either of his parents had fully recognized. One evening during those weeks, we were eating dinner, just the two of us. Something simple I had made because cooking helped me think. He put down his fork and looked at me directly. He said, "Mom, you're doing something. I can tell." I looked at my son. This boy who had his grandfather's patient eyes and what I like to believe is my stubbornness and my ability to wait. And I said, "I am protecting us. In the way that actually works, baby." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way teenagers do when they have understood something they will not be able to put into full words for another few years. He picked up his fork. He said, "Okay," and he passed me the salt. That moment, that simple, quiet, completely ordinary moment, is the one I return to more than any other in this story. Because in that moment, nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been proven. I had no guarantee that any of my preparation would work the way I hoped. I was still a woman sitting at a dinner table with an empty chair across the room. But my son trusted me, and that was enough to keep going. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. I remember the morning with unusual clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives on days your life changes permanently, even before anything has happened. The sky was that flat, gray November color, the kind of sky that commits to nothing. Ethan made me coffee before I left. He did not make a big moment of it. He just put the mug on the counter next to my keys and said, "You got this, Mom?" Then he went back to his room. I drove to the courthouse alone. The courthouse was one of those older buildings with wide stone steps and high ceilings, the kind of place that feels permanent, like decisions made inside it have weight. I suppose they do. My attorney Sandra met me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was dressed sharply and she looked, I noticed, like a woman who had slept well. That steadied me. Sandra does not sleep well before cases she is uncertain about. She squeezed my arm and said quietly, "Everything is in place." I nodded. I already knew. Marcus arrived with his attorney, Gerald Ashford, a senior divorce attorney with a strong reputation and an expensive suit. Gerald walked the way lawyers walk when they are certain about the outcome. He had spent the past several weeks pressing every negotiating advantage. Boy, he had earned his fee and he knew it. He was ready to close a clean, decisive win. Marcus looked good. He had gotten a fresh haircut. He was wearing the charcoal jacket I had always told him suited him, which I noticed and decided not to feel anything about. He smiled when he saw me across the hallway. It was a small smile, not unkind, The kind of smile you give someone you have already moved past, someone who no longer occupies the forward part of your thinking. He believed he had already won. You could see it in the way he held his shoulders. We took our seats inside. Judge Patricia Lowe presided, a composed woman in her late 50s who had clearly seen every version of this story across decades on the bench. She reviewed the settlement agreement that had been filed in advance, then looked up. "Ms. Hargrove, you have reviewed this agreement in full. You are agreeing to the terms as written. The property, the business interest, the joint accounts?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "And you have had independent legal counsel throughout this process?" "Yes, Your Honor." She studied me for a moment longer than was required. Judges develop a particular kind of sight after enough years. They look for the thing behind the thing. She was looking for fear, for coercion, for a woman who had been pressured into something she did not fully understand. She did not find any of that. She found a woman who had made a very deliberate decision and understood it completely. All right," she said. "Let us proceed." The settlement agreement was passed down the table for signatures. Marcus signed first. He picked up the pen with the easy confidence of a man finalizing the best transaction of his life. He signed his name cleanly and set the pen down and exhaled, a long, quiet breath, the kind that carries an entire season of tension out with it. It was the exhale of a man who believed the story was over. I signed next. I signed calmly and set the pen down and folded my hands in my lap. Gerald Ashford was already closing his leather portfolio. He and Marcus had a lunch reservation. I had heard them confirming it in the hallway. Gerald was going to have the salmon. Marcus had wanted the steak. And then Sandra reached into the file folder in front of her and placed a second document on the table. Not a document from the divorce proceedings, a letter, a formal legal notification from a federal agency. She slid it across the table to Gerald. Gerald picked it up. He read the first line. He read the second, and the color left his face so completely, so immediately, that the court reporter looked up from her keyboard. Marcus leaned in. "Gerald, what is that?" Gerald placed the letter face down on the table. He looked at Marcus with the careful, controlled expression of a man who has just realized that the building he is standing in is on fire, and that his client does not know it yet. He said in a very quiet voice, "We need to speak privately, right now, before we go any further." Marcus looked at me. He looked at me the way he had not looked at me in years. Not through me, not past me, not at a version of me he had already decided I was. He looked at me and saw me. And something crossed his face, a slow, dawning, irrevocable understanding that he had been reading the wrong map for a very long time. I held his gaze. I did not smirk. I did not smile. I did not need to say a single word. I simply picked up my bag, stood, thanked Judge Lowe quietly, and walked out of that courtroom. With my son, with my freedom, with everything that actually mattered. The letter Gerald Ashford read in that courtroom was a formal notification that the IRS had opened a full examination of Marcus's business entity. The examination covered the 3 tax years I had documented and submitted months earlier through the official whistleblower process. The notification referenced the property, the house Marcus had just signed for with such satisfaction, as a potentially encumbered asset. A federal tax lien for assessed unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest had been filed the previous afternoon. The number attached to that lien was $1.8 million. The house Marcus had fought for, The house I had appeared to surrender without a single argument now had a federal lien against it larger than its appraised value. He could not sell it freely. He could not refinance it. He could not use it as collateral. He was the proud new sole owner of a property that was legally frozen. The business he had taken was now the subject of a federal examination. Its real financial position, once the liability exposure was factored in honestly, was deeply negative. Not low value, negative. He had not taken an asset. He had taken a debt with his name on the door. The cars were leased. He had known that. But he had not thought through what it meant to carry both payments alone on a single income while simultaneously paying Gerald Ashford's hourly rate to manage a federal tax matter. The joint investment accounts he had celebrated, they would need to be disclosed as part of the examination. Their immediate availability was uncertain. And me? I walked out of that courthouse with full, uncontested custody of my son. With zero involvement in the IRS matter, I was a protected whistleblower,